Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we are continuing with our weekly series of Shirim, the Torah of Recovery, with the light revealed. And in this week's Parsha, Parshas Acharei Mos, we encounter a moment of limitation. We encounter a moment, a pivotal moment, a moment where a pivot is necessary in terms of how we react to apparent loss. Acharei Mos is the process of Aaron HaKohen and Klal Yisrael coming to terms with the departure of the tzaddikim, Nadav and Avihu, through their own process of bringing that foreign flame to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we're going to discuss. And through the processing, we've come to a place of Acharei Mos. Acharei Mos, now it's afterwards. Acharei hadvarim ha'ila, something previous has ended. Now, obviously, as we've spoken so often, that the nature of death, and may it only be understood in the simplest of forms, is an idea that can be expanded and extended across territories of experience, meaning to say that death doesn't only represent the cessation of human life, but rather represents the ending of anything. As the Zohar Kadosh says, and we've spoken about, that any degradation, any moment of descent away from where I was previously operating in a mindset of open and expansiveness, and I find myself in a lower state, that can be considered as a moment of death, meaning to say anything can be considered the rock bottom, as if I am able to recognize it as a departure away from where I would like to be operating. And so we all encounter this process of Acharei Mos, of after the ending of something, of after the ending of an idea, of after the ending of a way that I thought I was going to be able to live my life, after the ending or the death of an idea that I thought I needed to live with, or an object that I thought I needed to live with, and now I have ended that relationship with that thing. Now I have let go of something. I have let go of chametz. I have become free from something. When I become free from something, there's also an element of Acharei Mos, that I had a relationship with that thing, even if it was destructive, even if it was a maladaptive relationship. In the end of the day, it served the purpose. We must remember that in the heart of any unhealthy attachment to any object, there is always a form of thinking that the individual feels is the only way to think, meaning to say that the substance or the object that becomes the addictive process or the thing that a person is enslaved to, that is an answer to a question. And if the answer that a person needs is such a strong, powerful, and destructive answer, that means that the question is also feeling that way for the individual. And so anytime a person comes to end a relationship with something that was destructive in their lives or something that was unnecessary in their lives, even though there's a joy that comes with letting go of that, moving away from Mitzrayim, moving away from constriction, there's always going to be a grappling with and a mourning process of what has now died, what has gone away, what is the previous life experience, the previously held belief, the previously assumed position and posture of my life that I am saying goodbye to. And it's very important for us to mourn things properly, because if a person doesn't mourn something properly, even if the thing that I'm mourning is a positive thing, it's a positive departure away from behavior, away from an idea, away from something that was no longer needed. Nevertheless, if we are too premature in our artificial joy over the opportunity to say goodbye to something unwanted, we don't necessarily give ourselves the patience or the necessary time to actually mourn the fact that, in spite of the fact that that thing was destructive and it wasn't what I needed in my life, nevertheless, it served a purpose. Because if we don't identify the purpose that those negative or unwanted or extra things in our lives served, then we are not going to know how to protect ourselves and how to learn to tend to that area which seemingly desires more types of healing. So we want to look at the perspective of Acharei Mos as, how do I grapple with this transition from living in an enslaved way, living enslaved in Mitzrayim to whatever I'm enslaved to, and entering into freedom, the dizzying nature of freedom, the anxiety of freedom, as the existential psychotherapists so often spoke about, is ultimately the possibility of my own most responsibility now to live my life without the thing that I previously felt that I had. Now, how am I going to function? All I know is my life of servitude. All I know is the taskmaster. All I know is the thing that controlled my morning, afternoon, and night. All I knew were the instructions that were given over to me by the object or the Lord that was lording over me. And now I find myself free, and all I know how to do is complain about the fact that the water tastes bitter, etc., etc. So this transitionary place from moving from a state of of abject exile into the dizzying light of freedom is always marked by the dual tendency to, on the one hand, want to be joyous, and on the other hand, wanting to mourn. And it's something incredible that what HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done for us in arranging the calendar is that the Pesach experience, the freedom from exile, is ultimately met and celebrated with afterwards with the Sfiras HaOmer process, which is our counting now towards the actual grappling with the transition that we've made. But because of secondary elements, which are obviously inherently connected to the very fabric and texture of the time period itself, there's also a mournful quality to it as a result of the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva who did not know how to treat one another properly. They did not know how to deal with the endings of one identity and the beginning of another identity. They didn't know how to tend with the death of subject and the birth of object, etc., etc. And as a result of that, so there's a natural tendency of a mournful stance. And that can be understood because any freedom from something, in spite of the fact that the thing that was enslaving me was negative, and thank God, and I have to be grateful and offer my praise to my higher power, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for taking me out of that difficult place. But nevertheless, we have to treat ourselves kindly and recognize that I'm not an idiot. What I was stuck in was clearly serving as some element of a purpose. It was some self-medicating of an idea of an object or whatever it was. And therefore, I wasn't just doing something because I'm a bad person or because I don't care what other people say. I was doing something because it was serving a purpose. And if I don't mourn the fact that that purpose that was now that was being tended to, albeit in a destructive way, is now being left open and no longer being tended to, and I'm going to miss the ease with which that other thing seemed to have fixed the problem. So there's a necessary process of mourning that must be gone through, unless it's going to lead to complicated grief, which will more than likely drive a person back to that object of desire. And so in this time after Pesach, we encounter that slight sense of a mournful awareness of the fact that Acharei Mos, after the end of something, after the death of the servitude, after the death of the enslavement that I lived, there's also a grappling. There's a grappling with the newfound responsibility of freedom that must take into consideration the natural, albeit difficult to place, mournful position towards what I'm letting go. It's not easy. It's not easy to let go of something in a person's life. It's not easy at all. And we have to give ourselves credit for the effort that it takes and the ability to respect the process and to be aware of my emotions that say, no, it's not something I want to let go of. It's something I have to let go of because the thing itself was serving some sort of purpose. It was theoretically healing some sort of wound, but nevertheless, the healing of the wound created consequence. And as a result of that, I am choosing to live in the mindset of maturity and responsibility where I let go of that thing in spite of the fact that it was providing some theoretical beneficial element to it. And that's the process of Acharei Mos. And what is going to be the reorientation? What is the reorientation that when we pause, Acharei Mos, when I grapple with the fact that I've now taken something out of my life, I've let go of some self-defeating belief or some object orientation that was unhealthy, or an unhealthy relationship, or an unhealthy relationship to an object, or an unhealthy dependency, or an unhealthy addiction, God forbid, and all of the various stages of servitude that we engage with in our lives on a day-to-day level, that we break free from on a day-to-day level as well. So the question is, what is the repositioning? What is the reposture? And this is something we've seen and we've spoken about. We spoke about this early in the Inner World of Addiction series as well, in the Shir, The Pleasure of Self-Overcoming. But what Nadav and Avihu teach us, and what Yom Kippurim teaches us, and what the entire process for the Ketores teaches us, all of the elements that are expressed in this week's Parsha and Acharei Mos, of how a person grapples with that transition from having had what I thought I needed to moving into a place of no longer needing what I thought I needed, but also feeling that barrenness, that midbar type of experience, as I now wait to receive the true light that I truly want, which is the light of the Torah. So what is the reorientation? The reorientation is what Nadav and Avihu teach us, which is that more often than not in spirituality, refrain and holding oneself back from something is reflective of a far deeper strength and a far more essential and interior power within the self than expression. That there are two pathways in which the human being experiences life, and that's reflective of the two pathways through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals every element of existence from within his infinitude, Kavyachol. The Tzimtzum and the Kav, constriction and revelation, Hester and Giloi. There is the movement from the outside, from the inside to the outside, which is a movement towards revelation, an expressive drive outwards, to do, to positively engage, to accomplish, to move forward, to cover ground, etc., etc. And at the very same moment, there is a hastara, there is a hiskapsus, there is a tzimtzum, there is a constriction, there is a limitation, there is a limit setting, there is a measuring, there is a carving, there is an engraving, there is a making space, there is a holding breath that is the opposite of expression, but rather it is an internalization and intensification inwards that is always for the sake of preparing oneself for a further moment of revelation. And these two expressions of self, this chesed and the gevura, the expression and the withholding, are both fundamentally present in every aspect of a person's life, from the most basic elements of breath, which is in and out, ratzav v'shov, to the deepest concepts of contemplation in terms of pnimius haTorah and tefillah that a person can imagine, which is the sha'ashuin ha'elyonim, which is also chesed and gevura in this perpetual dance. The expression and the holding back at the very same point. The tzimtzum, which is the constriction, and the gilui, which is the revelation, but in a simultaneous way where both are taking place in their paradoxical dance at every moment. And generally speaking, when we look at ourselves, when we look at spiritual life, when we look at psychological well-being, we tend to give credence to the notion that expressing oneself is far greater than withholding oneself, that the things that I build are far greater than the things that I hold internally. And that my ability to express myself upon reality and to give in to that natural tendency to extend outwards is higher and more powerful than that inner, more silent, kind of modest ability to withhold, to remain silent within the self, not out of timidness or smallness, but rather a comfort and a responsibility to the self that knows that time takes time and things take time. We tend to assume that expressing myself, doing, giving in, acting, eating, partaking, doing something active, using something is always more valuable than not using something, than withholding from something. We assume that the yes is stronger than the no. We assume that the more ground I can conquer, the more I can give into, the more fluid I am, and the more I restrict myself, the more timid I am. And that posture leads to a notion of, not only does it drive capitalism, but it drives the entire notion of consumerism and the desire towards devouring things and craving, which is always that I need to give in, I need to move outwards, I need to extend, I need to say yes to this moment, I need to say yes to this experience. I need to be in love with this moment. I need to engage by way of ahava, by way of expression and the unfolding light of chesed. And that notion comes from a very real place, because Chachma and Chesed and the expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light is obviously the most powerful force in reality. And in truth, the expressive drive of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinite light is higher than the restrictive drive at the end of the day. But nevertheless, that's klape God, that's true by God. But by us, what we have to understand is that there's a pivotal moment where we reorient ourselves and realize that perhaps the no is going to be more powerful, more positive an experience than the giving in. Because if we live our lives with the assumption that covering ground and moving forward and extending outwards in the mindset of chasadim and expression and doing and eating and devouring and partaking in every element of one's life, as these metaphors can be applied, the yesness of life, the saying yes to life in each and every moment, of being fully present as if I need to accomplish, as if I need to do in order to be, that because we live our lives oriented towards that place, so we assume the no to just be restrictive. We assume the no to just be the absence of the yes. We assume the no, or we assume the limit, or we assume the restriction to simply be the negation of doing because we're not allowed to do, or that we don't deserve to do, or that's not for us, or we don't have the kalim or the money or the right to do that thing. And therefore the no becomes restrictive. The withholding becomes restrictive. It's seen as a cutting off of one's power. It's seen as a neutering. It's seen as a withholding of one's essential drive to extend outwards, and those self-destructive philosophies that we've seen throughout history. But ultimately, the secret of Pnimius HaTorah, the secret of recovery, is ultimately that within the no is a far greater and essential strength than the yes itself. There is a no that is simply saying no to a yes. There is a withholding for the sake of withholding. I don't do this thing anymore because it's destructive to me. I don't engage in this orientation anymore because it's destructive to me. But at the core of that, when a person learns to gain grips and handle that possibility of saying no in the right way, so what we uncover is the reality that when I withhold myself, when I'm atsamse myself, when I conceal myself, when I constrict myself, when I gain the possibility of self-control over myself, when I clench my muscles in order to limit and restrict the space in which I extend myself, but rather I apply the brake system to withhold myself and to encounter the natural imposition and discomfort that emerges out of that. Very often the discomfort of saying no to ourselves is not because the thing that we want is so comfortable, but because we just never do it. We have no idea how to properly be in that place, and therefore it feels like discomfort. But when a person slowly but surely learns the secret of the tzimtzum of the self, of the power and the active principle inherent within the closing off of the mind, within the closing off of the desire from engaging. And again, the opposite position of seeing the no and seeing withholding myself and not going into that Kodesh HaKadoshim like Nadav and Abihu did, and not being allowed to enter into the place that I fully want to enter into. So we generally see that as something that's undeserving. But what we're trying to tap into is the fact that hidden within the self-control and the application of limitation of the self from extending itself in any which way that it wants to, we are in fact encountering the deepest spiritual thing that we can do, which is setting limits for ourselves. What the Rebbe Rashab refers to as his gabrus ha'atzmius, self-overcoming. Ezuhu gibor ha'koivesh yitzro. What is gevura? What is that saying no? That saying no is in truth an overcoming and an intensification of self, because to arrest this natural proclivity of the self to extend itself outwards in any which way, it demands an uncovering of a strength greater than the power that is feeding off of that strength. Meaning to say, the shoresh of the gevura needs to be nisgala so that a person can gain the power to realize that, wait a second, I don't have to say yes in this moment. I don't have to give in. I don't have to do what my mind or heart are telling me to do in this moment. I can restrict, I can hold back in a healthy and positive way in which a person is not causing any harm to themselves, God forbid, or any type of restriction to themselves on a psychological, emotional, or spiritual level, but rather even the smallest holding back, the chewing one more time before swallowing, is considered a tzimtzum that reveals the deepest power of the self. And what we learn from Nadav and Avihu is that sometimes it is the withholding that is going to be the true connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as opposed to the giving in. Nadav and Avihu gave in on a certain level to the most natural desire that burns at the heart of the neshama, which is to enter into the Kodesh HaKadoshim at any moment, to live a life of full connectivity without deviation, to be fully inflamed within the ecstasy of it all, without any possibility of restriction or concealment. But ultimately, the secret of the process of Nadav and Avihu is that a higher level would have been the not going in, the holding back, the withholding, the tainug hamtana, the pleasure that comes about by being patient for something, because I'm expressing a far more essential part of myself in clenching my muscles of my fist prior to opening my hands. Because within that hiskavsus, within that constriction, within that intensification of self that creates the fusion of different parts of self internally to express itself with even more ferocity externally, that motivating force that drives the multiplicity of all things that comes about by way of gevura, that limitation, that application of those higher strengths within the self that externally appear to be lower because they're not expressive of anything, because they're withholding, that gives us a taste of la'asid lavo. That gives us a taste of a pleasure far greater than any pleasure that can ever be experienced, because the pleasure of non-pleasure, the pleasure of withholding from the capacity of experiencing pleasure, because I know that there's no pleasure that can possibly satisfy the desire for the pleasure that I desire, because in truth, the desire for the pleasure that I truly want is the pleasure itself. That desire is the nahar hayotzeh migan eden. That desire can never be satisfied by anything in this mitzias. There's no object in this world, as Medrash Chazal tell us, that can satisfy the craving of the soul. And therefore, it is specifically within the withholding of the attempt to quench or to satisfy that craving that a person finds satisfaction. That's the secret of Yom HaKippurim that we see in this week's Parsha, and why we read Nadav and Avihu on Yom HaKippurim, because on Yom HaKippurim, we refrain from partaking in food, we refrain from partaking in physical pleasure, but not out of punishment, not out of the reflection of the no that is only because I'm not deserving of the yes, but rather the yes is limited. Saying yes to something, expressing something is limited because it's limited to what I'm being expressed, is what's being expressed. The limitation of not being able to express anything is infinite because I'm not expressing anything, which means there's infinite gradations of what I can't express. And we're tapping into that light on Yom Kippurim, which is the tainug of Yom Kippurim, is the withdrawal away from the possibility of tainug, because I realize that there's nothing that can possibly satisfy the craving of my soul other than the Torah HaKadosha, which is nothing other than the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the light of my higher power, which satisfies me in my desire itself. This is the secret of what happens in Yom Kippurim, which is lahachyoisam bera'av, that there's a notion of I will feed you in your hunger, lahaspia b'tzach soches nafshecha, I will quench your thirst in your thirst. But rather what the tzaddikim say, what the Mittler Rebbe teaches so often, is that it is specifically within the thirst, that the ra'av, the hunger itself, the craving itself, redirected up to its essential source, which is the possibility of not giving into that craving, of saying no to that craving, touches upon a place of satisfaction that is far higher than any possible object can ever provide. And so within that no, within that setting of a limitation of the Kohen Gadol, who knows that I can go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but I don't. The nisayon of the Kohen Gadol is not to go into the Kodesh Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom HaKippurim. The Nisayon on a certain level is to know that the Kodesh HaKadoshim exists on Yom HaKippurim and to refrain from going into there on any other day of the year. The Koyach of the Kohen, Sheloi Shina, is the ability to withhold from entering it. Nadav and Avihu showed that they couldn't do that on one level or another, which is what we reorient ourselves with on Yom Kippur. This is the secret of today's Svira, which is Gvura Shebe Gvura, the strength of strength, the strength that emerges out of the expression of Gvura itself, the limit setting, the saying no to myself, and finding the pleasure within my ability to set controls to the rushing nature of my spirit, to allow myself to apply midos and shiurim and particular compartments wherein the self can be revealed, the secret of tzimtzum, the secret of the gilui that comes about by way of the gevura itself, the hamtakas adinim b'sharasham. That's what we're doing when we read Acharei Mos, the way to grapple with the depth of one way of thinking about pleasure in this world, which was giving in and giving in and giving in and giving in whatever form of the addiction that it takes, whether it be a thought, an emotion, an action. The reorientation of Acharei Mos, when a person says goodbye to that orientation of that giving in and needs to learn how to wait properly until the Torah HaKadosh is revealed to us, which is the secret of never fully being satisfied, but being satisfied within that dissatisfaction, because Torah Hashem Tmima Meshivas Nafesh, and the Torah is ultimately always going to be more perfect than me, because the Torah is always revealing to me that I've missed something, that I'm missing something. Meshivas Nafesh, I've lost something. Every time I come to the Torah, I lose something, and then I find something, and then I think I found it all, and then I realize that I'm still missing something, and it's Hadran Allah, I'll come back to receive something more, because the Torah is infinite, because it's a reflection of that which rests within and around and inside of the depths of the Torah itself, which is the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And until then, until we can get to that place of shvuas, of learning how to find pleasure in life again, of learning how to find those active principles in our lives, the doing and the activity and the movement outwards and the expression of self and the singing of song, in this place, in this man of Sfiras HaOmer, what we're orienting ourselves to is the Hiskavsus HaNefesh, the learning how to close in upon the self, to be mitzamsim l'machshava, to be meraches the nekuda hapnimis of the mind, to focus the mind, to close the lens. This is the secret of mindful awareness. This is the secret of attentional awareness. This is the secret of setting of an intention. Hareini mechavein. Kavana is by definition an act of tzimtzum, because I'm closing myself off to every other element available. This is the secret of lo. This is what the tzaddikim mean when they say that to refrain from a lo saseh is a far greater level than the accomplishment of an aseh. To refrain from doing something reveals a much higher strength than to actively get up and do something, because it reveals the strength of concealment, which is a far more essential strength than the strength of revelation. And just as this is true by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the tzaddikim explain, fundamentally, it is fundamental to us to understand that the saying no in our lives, the setting of healthy limits and boundaries, is not simply because we can't say yes, but rather the saying no is very often a far greater expression of a yesness than the yes could have ever expressed, because within the no, within the ability to set a limit, within the ability to say ad kan tavo, within the ability to make a tzimtzum of myself, to make a geder, to make a gvul, to cut something off and to stand firmly, like Choni Amagal, who says that I am not going to leave this circle until HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals what he needs to reveal. Choik nasan v'lo ya'avor, which is Rosh Tevos Choni, that koyach within the self to restrict itself and to plant itself firmly in the circle of tzimtzum, just like Hashem did, and say, Hashem, I am not budging until you take this desire away from me. I'm not giving into this desire. I'm not giving into this craving. It doesn't matter if I gave into it yesterday, and it doesn't matter if I give into it tomorrow. Today, I'm not giving into it. And in that place, the choik nasan v'lo, when a person firmly plants their feet in the ground and says to the Yetzer Hara, says to whatever it is that's taking them out of themselves, to the koyach hamadama that's not mezuchach, to the imaginative drives that project pleasure everywhere but where I find myself in this present moment, so I'm able to restrict them, I'm able to hold them back, and I'm able to uncover in the Kuda of Gan Eden, I'm able to taste the presence of the low, the highest level of Gam Kiilach B'Geit Samavas Lo Ira Rakiati Madi, that though I walk in the shadow of the valley of death, in that place of concealment of Acharei Mos, Lo Ira Rakiati Madi, I'm not afraid, because you're going to show me the light of Lo, you're going to teach me the secret of saying no, you're going to teach me the secret of limitations and constriction and counting one, and allowing each one to build upon the other slowly but surely until I come to the secret of Matan Torah, Be'ezras Hashem.